My name is Dr. Susan Haynes. I'm in the political science, the history, politics, and philosophy department here at the university, and I teach political science. Specifically, I'm in charge with many of the international courses like international security, international law, American foreign policy, counterterrorism, and that kind of thing. Today's event is brought to you by the Provost's Office as well as the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Some of you guys might be aware of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization here, my apologies, here in Tennessee. And it is dedicated to increasing awareness on international issues around the state of Tennessee. And it also has a mother organization, if you will, in Washington, D.C., which is the World Affairs Council of America, or WACA. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight or to bring to your attention for those of you who are at the Academy is that there is a statewide World Affairs Academic World Quest, which is kind of a quiz bowl of international affairs. So if you are all interested in international issues and foreign policy, you might be interested in forming a team. So there's teams of 4, and they compete across the state. We have about 25 teams that compete every year, and we compete for the title of the World Quest title. And the winning team gets a full, all expenses paid trip to DC for a week, where you get to visit the State Department, the White House, CIA, different embassies, and things like that. It's all paid for. If you're a college student in this room, we are also recruiting coaches for those teams, and that's something that you can get SALT credit for. University coaches teach or coach teams of 4 for academy students, and the practice times and et cetera are really what is up to you and your team. I know there was a team of 4 individuals that came from the academy last year and did very well, and I believe that they are interested in competing again this year. So you compete at the state competition, the state winners go on to DC, and then each state has a team, and that team competes for the national title. And then the national title winners get scholarships to study abroad in college. And so if that's something that interests you, you can contact, I believe, Mr. Countryman, and he can coordinate with me in terms of coordinating these teams. But we will also have university coaches that will help you in that endeavor. And so if international affairs is something that really interests you, that's something that makes you passionate, or just something you want to learn more about, I would encourage you to look at Academic World Quest as an option, right? The other thing that I want to bring to your attention in terms of upcoming events, both for university students as well as academy students, is we're going to have an International Careers Night. That's going to be on Tuesday, October 24th. So it's an evening event, completely optional for all students. But we do this once a semester, and what this is it exposes you to different types of careers in which you can travel, right? So this year, we will have someone from the State Department. We will have someone from the Japanese consulate. We will have someone from the CIA. We'll have someone from the Secret Service. And we will also have someone from the Peace Corps and Nissan. And this is 2 hours where people are able to answer all of your questions that you have and really kind of lay down a roadmap of what it might take to get these types of jobs. So they talk about their jobs, they talk about their international experience, what countries they went to, where they served, all these different things. And then the crux of the night, or the meat of the night, is really focused on, okay, if my job sounds interesting to you, here's my advice for what I would do as a high school student, what I would do as a college student to optimize my chances of getting in the CIA, to optimize my chances of being a foreign diplomat, to optimize my chances of being upper administration in an international corporation. So that's from 5:30 to 7:30 on Tuesday, October 24th, free pizza. We usually have people all across the state that come to this. We've had people from Chattanooga, MTSU, TSU, Fisk. I mean, it's usually a multi-university night because of the prestige of the speakers that come that evening. And RSVP is required just in case the auditorium packs out, because we usually have about 200 people. So I will make sure that your teachers and professors have that RSVP link so that you guys can have your seats, right, for that evening. And again, that is put on by the Tennessee World Affairs Council in coordination with the History, Politics, and Philosophy Department. So I believe our speaker has arrived, and I want to go ahead and introduce her so that we can have some context to this afternoon. Nancy Lindborg is the president currently of the United States Institute of Peace and has been there since February 2015. I know that many of you guys at the Academy have been at least reading kind of some preemptory material to learn about the United States Institute of Peace, but it was an institution or an institute founded by Congress in order to provide practical solutions for preventing and resolving violent conflict around the globe. Right, so practical peace building is what she'll be discussing and what she's dedicated her career to. Prior to the United States Institute of Peace in 2015, Nancy served as the assistant administrator for the Bureau for Democracy and Conflict and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. Prior to that, she was the president of Mercy Corps and served there for 14 years. So this is a woman who has absolutely dedicated her life to peace building and is an absolute leader in that regard. So I ask that you give your undivided attention to Nancy, and we are very, very honored to have her here with us today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. This is my first visit to Nashville, and it's been wonderful, and it's great to see everybody here today. And I want to talk to you about why, even at a time where it seems like there's rising conflict around the world, that people continue to do extraordinary work to build peace, often out of the headlines. And I want to talk to you about that and about why I remain an optimist. And as you just heard, I am the president of the United States Institute of Peace. And so I'd like to start by talking to you a little bit about USIP, which is the country's independent national organization, bipartisan, dedicated to building peace by preventing violent conflict and resolving violent conflict around the world. And this was really the culmination of several decades of effort. And it started with a group of senators and congressmen who came back from fighting in World War II and the Korean War, and they were really seared by their experiences on the front lines of war. And just as we have many naval academies, Air Force academies, military academies that are dedicated to training our warriors, they felt that it would be important to have additional capacity to train people to build and sustain peace. And so through a decade, they sought to have legislation passed, and about the same time, a group of citizens in the United States came together with this conviction that we needed to have a greater focus on how do we resolve conflicts around the world without resorting to violence. President Carter appointed a commission that went around the country talking to citizens about this idea, and that it gained quite a bit of support and a lot of enthusiasm. One of the important lines in this commission is that when there is war or likelihood of war around the world, there is no national security. So finally, it reported back to Congress, the commission's report, and the legislation was passed and signed into law by President Reagan in 1984. And since then, over the last 3+ decades, U.S. Institute of Peace has sought to address what are the current threats. So our work has changed as the global threat environment has changed. We saw that when we first were founded, there was an opportunity to work with universities around the country, and we helped to create the field of peace studies. And there are now a number of universities that have very mature, very extensive departments of peace studies, looking at what are the elements of peace, how do we understand various dynamics of how you sustain peace around the world, how you end it, how you end the conflict. And then during the Cold War, we also spent quite a bit of time working with diplomats on negotiation, on mediation at the state-to-state level. So how do the Russians negotiate? What does it mean to sit across the table from a Chinese or a North Korean diplomat? What are the different cultural styles of negotiation, and trained on how to do that more effectively? But then the Cold War ended, and the nature of threat around the world substantially shifted. And we went from the kind of wars that were between countries to conflicts and wars within countries. So civil wars and armed insurrections. And so USIP changed and shifted and evolved so that increasingly we began working with community leaders, faith leaders, local governments on how they can manage conflict more effectively. And we operate with the knowledge that there will always be conflict. There's conflict every day. You probably, maybe this week, had some kind of conflict. And the question is, how do we manage that conflict so that it doesn't turn into violence? And how do we resolve that conflict if it does become violent? Those are really the critical issues. And so we have been doing that kind of work with teams in hotspots around the world. We're working on about 20 conflicts. And there is, in fact, a sense of rising conflict around the world. As you look at the headlines of what's going on internationally, there's increasing number of civil wars. We are seeing historic levels of people who are displaced from their homes. There are right now 65 million people around the world, 65 million people who have been forced from their homes by violent conflict. This is, about 10 times the state population here in Tennessee. So imagine that 10 Tennessees have been forced from their homes. And at the same time, we are seeing that there is the specter of 4 famines at the same time: Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northeast Nigeria. And this is about 20 million people who are facing the possibility of dying from hunger. None of those famines are because of shortage of food. This is because of conflict has pushed those countries and those people to the brink of people being in that desperate state. And I would note that 10 years ago, 80% of our global humanitarian assistance went to people who were suffering from a natural disaster, like the kind of hurricanes that we just had. A decade later, today, 80% of our global humanitarian assistance goes to people who have been victims of violent conflict. So this is an enormous shift. I personally have spent the last 20 plus years of my life working in and around conflict, but much of that in response to crisis, after crisis have happened, going to places like Kosovo, like South Sudan, northern Uganda, Iraq, Afghanistan, places that have been devastated by wars and families torn apart. And you don't do that long without starting to think, how do we do a better job of getting at the root causes of those terrible tragedies? How do we understand the conflicts that are causing those problems, that are uprooting families? How do we resolve them earlier? How do we prevent them from happening? So I want to talk to you about 3 core strategies that we're using at U.S. Institute of Peace in a search for what are the very practical ways to prevent conflict from becoming violent and interrupt what are often spin cycles of conflict that keep countries in conflict often for decades. So the first strategy that I want to talk about is the importance of working not just from the top down, not just at the national level or diplomat level, but also at the community level, and enabling peace to happen locally, even when maybe it's not ready to happen nationally. And I'll use the example of Iraq, where we've worked for the last decade plus, and we've worked to train a group of Iraqis in the core skills of negotiation and mediation. And so as we see ISIS being driven out of cities in Iraq, we know that they're leaving behind communities that have been torn apart. The social fabric has been destroyed. Families don't trust each other. I think, maybe you or someone in your family colluded with ISIS, and I don't trust you. And the possibility is of using tribal justice and holding an entire tribe responsible for what an individual did. So U.S. Institute of Peace and our facilitators network went in and worked with both Shia and Sunni tribal leaders to forge an agreement that they would not use violence to solve the disagreements that were left in the wake of ISIS. And that also led to an agreement that enabled more than 300,000 families to return to Tikrit in one city where we worked. And so it went from being a war zone to today, a year later, 300,000 people have returned, the markets are thriving, the schools are open again, and we're working in the same way with tribal leaders, with religious leaders, with ethnic leaders in and around Mosul, which has just been liberated, and other cities in Iraq. So even as you watch the headlines and you see that at the national level, Iraq is not moving yet towards the peace that it needs, at the local, at the community, at the city, and even the provincial level, communities are choosing to the peace that they can build locally. Secondly, U.S. Institute of Peace for the last decade has had a peace and religion program, because we know very well that religion can drive people apart because of disagreements. It can also be a powerful connector and a powerful way to heal across communities. And so in northern Nigeria, in 1992, there was a terrible, vicious conflict between the Muslim and the Christian communities, and they were attacking each other. Several thousand people died. And fighting on opposite sides was Imam Ashafa and Pastor Wuye, and they were with their congregants fighting each other until, after terrible destruction, Imam Ashafa had a renewed sense that there had to be a better way. And he, with a great deal of reflection, decided that it was more important to look for forgiveness and reconciliation rather than continued violence. So he reached out to Pastor Wuye, and the two of them forged, over a period of years, a sense of trust that allowed them to reconcile, to start working together. And then they worked with their broader community in Kaduna State in northern Nigeria to broker a peace between their communities. When the state next door, several years later, erupted in conflict, they went and mediated there and led a reconciliation process. And now, many years later, peace has held in those two states, and the pastor and the imam, as they are now known throughout Nigeria and beyond, have trained thousands of other faith leaders and community leaders and women to be forces of reconciliation in their community. And we see this in many, many countries, the importance of working with leaders of faith to bring those core values to their communities to keep conflicts from becoming violent. And finally, we've seen the power of providing very practical tools to average community members. And I'd like to use the example of Flor, who was an indigenous woman we worked with in the rural community of Cauca, Colombia. And Colombia, as you know, just recently concluded 5 decades of civil war, where there was an armed militia group called the FARC that was fighting the government for decades. And Flor lived in a community that one day the FARC came into and kidnapped 38 of their children and took them back into the jungle where the FARC militia was located. So Flor, armed with these skills in negotiation and mediation, organized her community, and they went into the jungle, negotiated with the FARC, and came back with all but one of their children. It shows the power of what a determined community can do in protecting themselves and in finding resolution to those kinds of really terrible incidents. And even more importantly, Flora became a member of a group of women who participated in negotiating the final resolution to the Colombia conflict. They went to Havana, where the peace accords were being negotiated at a national level, and they sat at the table and they had their voice be a part of what should that peace look like. And this is important because what we know from our research is that for a peace accord to really be more sustained, it must be more inclusive. And when you have women and displaced people, people who've been affected by the conflict at the negotiating table, you have a 35% greater chance that that peace accord will last 15 years or more. It's more successful than just having the guys with guns at the table negotiating. So I just want to return to that sense of rising violent conflict around the world and note that it is true that in the last 7 years there has been an increase in civil wars, in violent extremism, in the number of people who have been displaced. But this is happening against a backdrop of a long peace over the past 70 years, when overall we've seen a huge decline in the number of conflict deaths, in the number of conflicts within countries, and even the almost non-existent level of wars and conflicts between states. And so what we know is that peace is possible. There's been extraordinary progress over the last 70 years, and that while it takes time, we absolutely are seeing the end to many of these conflicts. Some of the big conflicts that dominated the headlines some years ago, you don't hear about them anymore. Northern Ireland, for example, has gripped us for several decades. That's been solved. Liberia is about ready to have its first democratic election in its history as an independent country. So there's a longer peace, but there are threats right now that require that we are paying attention, that we not lose the many decades of progress, and that we focus on what are the ways that we as individuals and that we as a country can ensure that we don't lose the progress of the past 70 years. And Tennesseans are in a very important position to understand the unique role and the important role that the United States plays around the world. There are 71,000 Tennesseans in active or reserve military service right now, serving around the world. This is the next generation of people who have known war, who understand the vital importance of peace. And a quarter of the jobs here in Tennessee are related to international trade. So it's important for our economic health, it's important for our security, and it's important for the values that we share with so many people around the world, that it matters that 20 million people around the world are starving. And so what can you do? I want to end with a call to action, that it's important for you to be informed about what's going on around the world, that you understand the complexities of the conflicts. Each country, each conflict is unique. I invite you to go online and see what is the resources available at USIP.org. There are a variety of resources that you can access there. We also have a dedicated public education section. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague. There she is, Ann Louise Colgan, who's the director of our public education activities. We work with teachers around the countries and their students. I would also encourage you to check out the Tennessee World Affairs Council, which is our host today. We have been greatly honored to partner with the Tennessee World Affairs Council, including partnering with them on the Academic World Quest program that you can hear more about from Mr. Pat Ryan, who's here with us. We hosted the World Quest National Champions at our Washington headquarters last spring, and we look forward to doing so again. Have a conversation with somebody you disagree with. Make a pledge that over the next month you'll seek people out who have a different approach to the world than you do, and have a conversation to try to understand why that is. And stay aware of what's going on in the world, and engage with your congressional representatives and let them know that you care about what's happening. You have an opportunity, and I would say a responsibility, to be not just a citizen of this university, a citizen of Tennessee, of the United States, in a way that continues our ability to look out for our security, our economic interests, and importantly, the values that we espouse as Americans. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a conversation with you. When did I first get started in this work? Shortly after I finished university, I thought I was on my way to becoming an English professor. I have my undergraduate and graduate degrees in English literature. And I went just for a vacation, just to go on a trek in Nepal. And I ended up loving it and getting a job there and staying for 2.5 years in Nepal, and became aware of the Tibetan refugee population and started working with the Tibetan refugees. And my life just took a U-turn. And I realized I wasn't going to be an English professor, and began what has been a lifelong interest in working internationally and working with, as I said, initially in providing assistance after something terrible has happened, after somebody has become a refugee or displaced. And the more you do that, the more you realize, just like it's a difference between going to the doctor for a checkup versus going to the emergency room because things have gotten really terrible. And this conviction that we can do a better job of getting ahead of conflicts, and that we can understand and address and resolve the conflicts that are at the root of all of this. So after Nepal, I ended up going back and getting a different kind of degree, master's in public administration, and then lived in Kazakhstan for a while, and then have been jumping around to these different crises for the last 20 plus years. I think the biggest challenge is presented by those countries where you do not have a good relationship between the government and its people. And it's either because the government doesn't have the ability to take care of its people, the ability to provide basic services, water, education, health, or sometimes they don't want to, and they're in fact repressing their people. And we see this all too often, where one part of their population is marginalized, that is not provided the same kind of opportunities as the other parts of the country. And those countries are the ones where we see the greatest instability and the greatest potential and actual conflict. They're the countries that are the source of this refugee crisis that we're having right now. They are the countries with the greatest level of violent extremism. And they're the countries with the greatest levels of extreme poverty. And so it's really tackling this issue of people who live in countries where they have terrible governments, either unable or unwilling to deliver for their people. Well, in broad categories, what I just described, these governments, which are often called fragile states, I think fragile states are a huge risk for all of us. We've seen what happens when this flood of refugees hit Europe and became a destabilizing force. Not only was it a huge human tragedy, but it destabilized some of our key allies. And it's become a contentious debate in many countries, including our own. We're also seeing a significant threat with the possibility of a nuclear North Korea. That is a completely different kind of threat. And for the first time probably in your lifetime, I grew up in the era where nuclear threat was the major threat. And I grew up doing duck and cover drills where we would, practice sitting in hallways, in the event of a nuclear strike. And since then, of course, we've had all the international agreements that have kept that in check. And for the first time in decades, we have that threat again with North Korea raising that alarm. So two very different kinds of threats. So thank you for that. Her question is, what about the DRC, which has had decades of terrible conflict and child soldiers and terrible human rights abuses, and where does our work end and begin? DRC is a place where we don't have a deep engagement. In a number of countries, we have teams and partners on the ground. In the DRC, we've worked on some of the governance issues and some of the criminality issues. What I would note is that like many countries, DRC cannot pull itself out of what has been decades of conflict. And what you see, whether it's DRC or Colombia or Afghanistan or Central African Republic, is that when you have generations raised in conflict, you start losing that essential social fabric that keeps conflict from becoming violent. So you have generations who are raised, without knowing peace, and that has an impact. There's actually some very interesting studies, neuroscience studies, showing what happens to your brain when you are raised in a conflict environment. And it actually changes the neural architecture. It changes your brain so that you're less able to adapt, you're less able to deal with conflict, you're probably operating at a higher stress level. And so it's so important to find a way to interrupt that. And we don't have that many tools as an international community. One is peacekeeping troops, which have been in DRC for a number of years. One of the things that USIP does is train peacekeepers, particularly the African peacekeepers, on increasing their ability to communicate with, to work with the local communities where they're stationed. And we find that they are far more effective when, as a peacekeeper, you're able to interact with the community as opposed to being a force that can be feared. And we know that there have also been abuses by the peacekeeping forces. So one is trying to create greater citizen security so they don't grow up in conflict. And two is working with a network that is seeking to have more peaceful elections and improved governance and lower corruption. And in all of these, we work with a network of partners. These are all big problems, and we're a small institute. So part of what we do is we bring our research and our training and provide that to a much broader group of actors so that they can continue to learn what works and what doesn't work and apply it in those environments. So we work very closely around the world with our military, diplomat, and aid worker colleagues. USIP it's a bipartisan institution. We are part of the government, but we are not a part of the administration. But we do work very closely with State Department, DoD, and U.S. Agency for International Development. And I say that because all of our military colleagues will be among the first to say that once they're done clearing ISIS from Iraq and Syria, there's a whole nother level of effort that will be critical to both stabilize these countries and to help rebuild after the conflict. And I don't think that anybody is suggesting that the United States should or will go back in and rebuild Iraq for a second time. But what wasn't done effectively the last time around was to focus on the reconciliation process and rebuilding not just the infrastructure, not just the nuts and the roads and hospitals and schools, but the social infrastructure, the social fabric. And what we saw, what partly led to the rise of ISIS was the marginalization of the Sunnis by the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. And unfortunately, what we're faced with the Kurdish referendum is seeing how there is still a sense among the Kurds and among the Sunnis that the Shia Baghdad government is not including them in opportunities, in revenues, in resources. And so the role not just of the United States, but of the coalition, and I think of all of the allies, is to use all the tools that we have to help the Baghdad government be more inclusive, without which we face the possibility of having to go in and fight ISIS 2.0. What USIP contributes to that effort is, as I described, working at the community level to create that sense of inclusion and that sense of reconciliation. And we do so often in partnership with our military colleagues. And I will share one example of how that can be enduring. And in June, we just had an event where, with our colleagues from the 10th Mountain Division, Combat Division, who 10 years ago were stationed in a part of Iraq known as the Triangle of Death, because they were losing so many people. And in 1 year, the 10th Mountain Division lost 54 of their soldiers in 1 year. And so they realized that they were kind of at the end of what their military tools could do, and they asked USIP to come in and negotiate with the warring tribes, of which they were in the middle. And so over a period of months, we mapped the conflict, we worked with all the key actors, brought them together, and brokered a peace accord. And 10 years later, that has held. And that area, Mahmoudiya, the Triangle of Death, has remained peaceful. They remained resilient, even as ISIS was occupying adjacent areas. And we had an event with our 10th Mountain colleagues to remember that, to honor their colleagues who had died, and to look at what needs to happen to sustain this second round of military gains in Iraq and hopefully soon in Syria. And once the military is done, there is possibly decades of very hard work to rebuild those places. Peace is very possible, but it takes a long time. And that's one thing that sometimes as Americans we get impatient about. And it certainly doesn't happen in an election cycle. And so it can be generational in rebuilding these places. But if we don't do it, we could face a resurgence. Part of what USIP has done through its history is provide Congress with policy recommendations and also to serve as a convener. We have a wonderful building right on the mall in Washington, and I hope some of you have had a chance to visit Washington. I invite you to come and visit us at our building, where we look across at the Lincoln Memorial, so we're at that end of the mall. And we do a lot of convenings there, where we bring people together of differing views and ideas and expertise and help to hammer out and propose ideas for particularly difficult policy situations or conflict threats. So for North Korea, we will most likely be doing that kind of work. I spent 14 years of my life going in and out of North Korea. So it's an issue that I care deeply about. It's a particularly difficult issue because it is so isolated. It is not a part of the world community. It is not a part of these nuclear agreements. Its economy is, for the most part, not integrated with anybody else's. So it presents a particularly difficult challenge for the world community. There are opportunities for us to work with China and some of the other regional powers to devise pathways. But most important right now, I would suggest, is what Secretary Tillerson is doing when he goes to China to talk about the US policy of 4 don'ts. And he's saying we don't want a nuclear Korea, but we don't want regime change. We don't want our military to go north of the 39th parallel, and we don't want to hasten unification of the peninsula. And this helps to calm things down, to avoid the potential misunderstanding of what could be catastrophic if we were to actually move to nuclear strikes or any kind of military action. We have what we call research. We bring on research associates, which are primarily students who are either in or finishing grad school. And if you go to our website, usip.org, you can find all the listings of those opportunities. And we bring on board a fair amount of research associates, and it's a terrific way to understand the work, to see if that's the kind of work that you're interested in, and I invite all of you to take a look and think about a career in working on these kinds of conflict issues. One of the things that's really great about USIP that I enjoy is that we have on our team people from many walks of life. So we have former diplomats, former aid workers, former military, academics, anthropologists, and it's bringing all of those views and all of those different kind of backgrounds and expertise together that can sometimes help us put together the most useful strategies for building peace on a particular issue area or in a particular conflict zone. Thank you for that question, because it's actually one that we've been talking about a lot. I mean, we're a relatively small organization, and one of the hardest things is knowing that you can't do everything everywhere. So no, we're not in Venezuela, but one of the things that we have in USIP is an academy. It harkens back to the very original concept of USIP as being, akin to the naval academies or the military academies, where we're able to provide the training on very practical ways of preventing and resolving conflict. And over the last few years, we've created a part of that to be our online global campus, where we have the opportunity for people around the world to take our courses, things like conflict mapping, conflict analysis, mediation. And one of the courses that we offer is a series of classes on nonviolent citizen action, because we've done quite a bit of research that shows around the world when there is change because of nonviolent citizen action, it is infinitely more successful and lasts longer than when you have change as the result of violent action. And so there are actually tools and skills with how to conduct nonviolent citizen action. And we've seen over the past 6 months that there have been a huge number of people from Venezuela taking that course. So we contribute in ways that are not necessarily on the ground, directly ourselves doing it, but it's a part of how we leverage our impact by providing training and skills and information on peace building.